This video is sponsored by Raycon. Get 15% off their already affordable wireless earbuds with the link in the description. February 29th, 2020. The day of the first coronavirus death in the United States, reported at the time. The day, for Americans, that this mysterious, highly infectious disease went from distant news story to actual alarming reality. From the date of that first reported death, it would take less than 1 month for the US to become the most infected country in the world, passing Italy, then China, and eventually ending up in a category of its own. But although the outbreak was real everywhere, it was felt viscerally in the Northeast, one of only a handful of places in the country where headlines of despair seemed to match the daily experience of locals. There were not only 2 waves, but effectively 2 distinct pandemics. For those in and around New York, the coronavirus was all too horrifyingly real, creating a more vigilant atmosphere even now as new local cases stabilize. Masks are widely worn, hands frequently washed, and public spaces treated with caution. Outside of the Northeast Corridor, a very different pandemic played out. One where the first casualties were jobs, classes, and the conveniences of modern life. Reactions to government-imposed restrictions were so geographically divided, in part because the coronavirus was so geographically divided. Now, as infections surge across the country, a once regional crisis is becoming a shared disaster. Everyone, everywhere, is in some way affected by the virus. But it would be a mistake to say that everyone is affected equally. Just as in the early days of the pandemic, there are, broadly speaking, 2 very different groups of people. Those who've lost work, school, and their livelihoods, and those who can treat lockdown as a vacation. Generally speaking, this is an exceptionally great time to be rich, and an exceptionally bad time to be poor. Since March, around 50 million people have filed for unemployment, setting records not seen since the Great Depression. Meanwhile, the country's richest have seen their wealth explode. During that same period, the net worth of US billionaires has grown by almost 20%, and a dozen in particular have doubled their wealth. When most Americans were stuck in their hometowns, if not their living rooms, the richest among us, now untethered geographically by work, school, and friends, were on the move, to their vacation homes in Jackson Hole, Nantucket, and Sun Valley. There, in these small remote towns, wealthy families brought from their big cities the risk of infection. Teton County, for example, of which Jackson Hole is a part of, is one of the richest counties in the country, home, at least during ski season, of Bill Gates, Kanye West, Christy Walton, and Dick Cheney, to name just a few. Its one and only hospital, equipped with just 24 ventilators, was put to the test, as private jets swarmed local airports. Despite being home to just 23,000 full-time residents, Teton was Wyoming's second hardest hit county in April, surpassing other areas 3 or 4 times more populous, until the second wave hit. Other wealthy families booked out entire hotels or resorts for $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 a week. Finally, some went even further, preferring to leave the country altogether. Private jet companies were inundated with requests, both from a lack of available scheduled flights and a concern for health and safety. One study suggests regular passenger air travel involves 270 person-to-person interactions, while private flights expose a customer to less than 20. But while demand for a safe place to hide is clearly very high, it's far harder to find supply. Pandemic tourists, as you might call them, are looking for 3 things. Someplace coronavirus is under control, somewhere that is isolated and likely to avoid further outbreaks, and, of course, somewhere that will let them in. The trouble is that any country which meets the first 2 criteria likely did so by avoiding the third. In other words, any place where outbreaks are contained likely closed its borders early and is unwilling to undo its hard work now. This rules out the vast majority of countries. Italy, for instance, denied entry to 5 US citizens who flew from Colorado earlier this month on a private jet. The risk of allowing them in, despite their riches, is just too high. But not everywhere. There are a few countries where the benefits of tourism are so insanely high as to outweigh the risk of further outbreaks. These are mostly small island nations like Fiji, the Bahamas, and the Maldives. For the latter country, travel and tourism comprise nearly 40% of its GDP. These are places that can't afford to lose visitors. But with limited healthcare infrastructure, they really can't afford an outbreak, and therefore had to take the lesser of two very bad evils. Take the case of Fiji. Its borders were first closed on February 3rd, weeks before the first confirmed case, to any foreigner who had visited mainland China in the past 14 days, in addition to screening the health of passengers during their flights to Fiji. On the 27th, this ban was extended to all travelers from Italy, Iran, and parts of South Korea. 18 days later, cruise ship stops, international events, and government travel were also cancelled. 3 days after that, Fiji confirmed its first case, a Fiji Airways flight attendant who had recently flown to San Francisco and Auckland. After this first person began a chain of community transmission, infecting 4 others, locals expected the worst. In early March, it became the first Pacific Island country to open a WHO-certified testing lab, and the 4th Pacific country capable of testing for COVID-19. This enabled instant results, rather than waiting for samples to be sent to Australia. By the end of the month, its main international airport was closed, and a military-enforced curfew announced from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. Then, an amazing 78 days went by between its 18th and 19th cases. As of early July 2020, despite a population of 883,000 spread across 300 islands, Fiji has recorded a total of 21 infections, making it possible to list every past and present case in a single frame. It's also managed a 100% recovery rate, with the vast majority of recent cases coming from returning locals staying in quarantine. In this way, Fiji perfectly encapsulates the dilemma of countries like it. Having made early and painful sacrifices to prevent an outbreak, they now have a new kind of vacation amenity, being free of coronavirus, that they're eager to reap the benefits from, but at the risk of making things much, much worse. Every country, island, and city depends on tourism to a different degree, and thus every country, island, and city has responded differently. Cuba, for example, has divided the country such that visitors stay only in designated resort areas and don't infect the general population. Hawaii, on the other hand, will allow travelers to skip its mandatory 2-week quarantine if they present a negative test result 72 hours before arrival. Fiji, like several other countries, has come to a different conclusion. It knows that the risk of welcoming visitors is directly proportional to the number who arrive, but the number of visitors is not necessarily proportional to the benefits they bring. They can minimize the risk of reopening while maximizing the income they generate by inviting only the rich. To quantify this fact, Australia is the largest source of arrivals in Fiji, accounting for just under half of the total. They spend, on average, $116 per person per day, and $1,039 per trip. A cruise ship passenger, in comparison, spends $44 on average per port of call. And finally, someone arriving by yacht spends $3,615 during their average stay. In total, the yachting industry contributes approximately $28 million to the Fijian economy every year, not that far behind the $44 million brought by the cruise industry. Cruise ships expose the islands to 239,000 passengers a year, while yachts expose them to just 4,473. By comparing these numbers, we can very crudely estimate that yachts bring approximately 2% the risk of infection that cruise ships do, while contributing 63% as much to the local economy. This is the thinking behind Fiji's new Blue Lanes program, which allows billionaires to bypass its coronavirus border restrictions. Its prime minister announced that yachts and pleasure craft will now be allowed to enter one of its ports. If a ship's journey there took 14 days or longer at sea, and its passengers show proof of a negative test result, everyone on board will be screened for symptoms, and if deemed healthy enough, allowed to roam the country. If their journey was shorter, they can make up the remaining time in quarantine. If someone arrives from Sydney after 8 days at sea, for example, they can pay for 6 days of quarantine, and then proceed to hide out on a remote private island. And Fiji is not alone. Many countries are competing for the VIP crowd. Seychelles is also allowing visitors who arrive on private or chartered flights and then stay on an isolated island resort. Thailand, the Maldives, and other countries have similar plans. In all likelihood, only a very small number of billionaires will arrive. So far, Fiji has announced 30, but that is precisely the goal: to cash in on their strong early pandemic response while inviting very little additional danger. If it works, international travel may slowly revert to the status it once held decades ago, reserved mostly for the rich and fairly inaccessible to everyone else. One thing that is getting much more affordable are wireless earbuds. Raycon sent me a pair of their everyday model, and I've been wearing them every week at the gym since. They start at just about half the price of other wireless earbuds, help block out the noise around you, and last up to 6 hours on a charge. I've used other wireless earbuds before, and I was pleasantly surprised by how durable Raycons are. Although not exactly recommended, I've even heard of them surviving accidental trips to the washing machine. They won't fall out of your ears because they come with 5 extra different size tips. Plus, you can even choose from a selection of 6 colors to truly make them your own. Get 15% off with the link in the description, and my thanks to Raycon for sponsoring this video.